Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. I think most everyone would agree that Al-Qaeda, which attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon 18 years ago on September 11th, clearly a terrorist organization. But what about when we talk about domestic organizations? Perhaps there isn't a whole lot of argument that neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups are domestic terror organizations, but what about the NRA, which the San Francisco Board of Supervisors just a few weeks ago labeled in a resolution a domestic terror organization, or the anti-fascist group Antifa? What about efforts in Congress and in states across the country to expand the definition of domestic terrorism? Is that a good thing, or are there perils in doing so? My guest today helps us talk about and work through that issue. Erik Schechter is a public relations executive in New York and was formerly a journalist, in particular for the Jerusalem Post in Israel, and was himself a victim of a suicide bomber in Israel in 2004. He's got a unique perspective on this issue. He wrote a very powerful and compelling op-ed for NBC News very recently, which we'll provide a link to in the description for this episode. It's a really important issue, I think, particularly as our politics heat up ever more intensely as we move from 2019 into the full swing of a presidential campaign next year. Really important conversation about what is and what should be domestic terrorism. Stay tuned. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about domestic terrorism, both the kinds that people are very well familiar with, such as the attacks that occurred on September 11th, 18 years ago, and on efforts from both sides of the political spectrum to label groups that aren't conventionally thought of as terrorist organizations or domestic terror organizations, just that, and why that actually is a move that presents some pretty significant problems. My guest today to help us talk about this and understand this issue better is somebody who tragically knows firsthand an awful lot about terrorism, and he's going to talk to us about that and how that has informed his perspective on this issue. Erik Schechter. Erik, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Aaron, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, let's give us a little background on yourself, Erik. I had the pleasure of speaking with you a couple of weeks ago as we were discussing what we might talk about today, and I know you have a very specific and powerful experience with terrorism. So tell us about your own background, who you are, and a bit about the experience that you had in Israel a number of years ago, and then let's get into the topic for today, the issue of domestic terrorism.
Sure. So currently, I'm the CEO of Red Phantom Public Relations, and my clients tend to be in the security and defense industries. But previously, I was a reporter for the Jerusalem Post. I was a military correspondent, and I covered a lot of security issues, including terrorism. And then, while I was going to work in Jerusalem, this would have been 2004, a suicide bomber got on the bus and detonated and wounded me, wounded dozens of others, killed 11 people, and obviously himself. And I recovered from that terrorist attack, and I went on to write more stories relating to terrorism. I've interviewed a number of terrorists, either would-be suicide bombers who did not succeed, or the dispatchers, the people who send out the suicide bombers, as well as the occasional gunman
Mm-hmm. Well, and you also published on the anniversary of September 11th, very recently, a piece that was an op-ed piece, I believe, for NBC on this issue that we're going to talk about today, which is the danger of expanding the definition of what is domestic terrorism. Again, people, I don't think, have any problem agreeing that those who perpetrated the attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon on 9/11 were terrorists, and people are familiar, not perhaps as directly as you are, with the idea of suicide bombers in Israel and elsewhere in Europe over these years. Nobody has a real problem, I think, with recognizing that those people are terrorists, but the concept of domestic terrorism is something that is a lot more fuzzy and controversial. And you address this in this op-ed piece. Perhaps you could start by giving us a bit of a summary of the point of view you expressed in that piece, and that may then help launch us into the subject today.
Sure. I do want to take a step back and just say you did a good division between foreign international terrorism, such as we saw on 9/11, that's terrorism stemming from outside, or terrorism that has occurred outside of the United States, versus homegrown domestic terrorism, which is what I was addressing in my op-ed. And the two are interrelated because terrorism is terrorism wherever it occurs, but how we deal with them is different. Now, typically we have, when we're dealing with international terrorists, we have this list of terrorist organizations, and therefore you cannot sponsor them. Your mere involvement in them would label you a terrorist. We don't have that for domestic groups, because we would run into First Amendment issues. Instead, what we have is a definition of domestic terrorism that comes from the Patriot Act, and it's not great, and it's not specific, and these definitions have only gotten worse over time, and they've gone to the point that they're now highly politicized.
The Patriot Act being the act of Congress that was passed in the wake of 9/11,
correct,
ostensibly to bolster security, investigation, intelligence operations, that created the Department of Homeland Security and other expanding operations of the federal government to combat terrorism. That's what you're referring to, right?
Yes. And the Patriot Act and sort of establishes a definition. The problem with that definition is that it doesn't preclude attacks on military targets. So typically when we think of terrorism, both international or domestic, we think of terrorism as some form almost of illegal warfare. In other words, what you're trying to do is apply lethal force or near lethal force against a civilian target to coerce a government to change a policy. And it's very important that the target is civilian, because that is what makes this whole thing abominable. If it was just attacking a soldier, well, that's warfare, non-state or state. And so we already have started off on the wrong foot with the Patriot Act, and then subsequently we have, bills that industry basically wrote, like the, Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, where you steal a bunch of minks from a fur factory, then you become a domestic terrorist. No one's life, whether soldier or civilian, have to be threatened. You could just be doing economic damage, and all of a sudden, you fall under the rubric of domestic terrorist. But recently, what we've had is, in the wake of the shootings, and then other issues going on independently, whether it's a gun control issue or whether it's Antifa, you're having people now either try to pass real bills or grandstanding with these non-binding bills. Both of them come with their own sort of danger.
Well, and
if you want,
it's a definitional problem, as I think we're both getting to focus on here. Maybe we have to bring one of the more clear examples of the definitional problem that we're talking about, which is what happened in San Francisco a few weeks ago, my hometown.
Right.
As you point out, in the wake of another spate of mass shootings, including the one in El Paso, which quite clearly was perpetrated by somebody who was interested in targeting Hispanics, Latinos, as a way of expressing hate. Right. A mass shooting, a mass hate crime. And in the wake of that, and other mass shootings that have taken place, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a resolution declaring that the NRA is a domestic terrorism organization. And as you point out in your op-ed, you may think that the NRA is an odious organization, to use your word, but it's not, as you argue, a domestic terrorist organization, even though lots and lots of Americans, according to polling, think that it is. So why isn't the NRA, in your view, a domestic terror organization? And how do we know one when we see one, so to speak?
Well, because it's not directly going out launching attacks against civilians. It's not providing money to organizations that are launching attacks against civilians. Basically, what the San Francisco Board of Supervisors is trying to say is that, and I'll just quote their declaration, is that the NRA, quote, through its advocacy, and there's my emphasis, through its advocacy, has armed those who would and have committed acts of terrorism. So, again, they're attacking them on a free speech, on a First Amendment issue. First, you can advocate lots of things. And then on top of that, no, it hasn't directly armed them. It's not buying them their guns. It basically is just advocating for laws that many people think are very dangerous laws and very irresponsible laws, and that lead to thousands of people being killed a year. But they're still only advocating. They're not launching terrorist attacks. And so it's very dangerous when we start to walk away from a strict definition of terrorism. And you see this sort of drift, this politicized drift as well with Senators Bill Cassidy and Ted Cruz when they try to label, and President Trump as well, when you start to try to label Antifa as a terrorist organization. Now their argument is that, look, these guys are actually physically attacking people, civilians, in order to scare them off and achieve a political goal. Well, yes, they are, but they're not. Nothing what they're doing resembles terrorism. It doesn't resemble, like, the people's lives are not endangered. No one actually quakes in fear at night that they might be the victim of a milkshake or being punched in the nose by Antifa. It barely clears the level of a barroom brawl.
Well, and for anybody who doesn't know, Antifa actually is is a joining together of two words, or a hyphenated word anyway, anti-fascist. I mean, that's where the name Antifa comes from, and perhaps their most prominent place in our understanding of what's been going on in our politics recently is the role of Antifa protesters in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. The Antifa protesters came out as counter demonstrators to the white nationalist and white supremacist organizations who actually were coming to Charlottesville to foment actual acts of violence. So one of the distinctions you're making here is the difference between advocacy, or put differently, what we would call protected First Amendment speech in this country anyway, where we have a First Amendment, and acts of violence, right? You can't call the NRA even a violent organization, let alone a terrorist organization, if what they are doing is mere advocacy.
Correct.
Okay. But then we get into this line, we've talked about this on this podcast a number of times, between protected speech under the First Amendment, even hateful speech. And of course, the most famous example in our country's history may well be the march of the Nazi demonstrators in Skokie, Illinois, which the ACLU defended in court and won, where they were merely demonstrating, although expressing very hateful, odious speech on the one hand, and on the other hand, speech that isn't protected, that our courts say is not protected speech, where that speech incites others to violence. And that inciting to violence is, I think, another way in which our politics has really blurred distinctions, because we can now say, oh, you're inciting to violence by mere words that I don't like, or right, that even the president is accused routinely these days. And I'm not saying this in any defense of Donald Trump, but he is routinely attacked these days in our politics for inciting violence. Right. And that's an important distinction.
Well, here's the thing. If you lower, and I said in my piece, if you lower the threshold of terrorism to go from something that resembles warfare, or something where people's lives are at stake and people genuinely are terrorized and fear for their lives, to just people going fisticuffs, then what about the people who, punched demonstrators at Trump rallies? They clearly had a political objective. They clearly used violence, and they used it against civilians. So if you're going to lower the bar so low that Antifa or Antifa are terrorists, then so would those Trump supporters be. And if I believe he was a candidate at the time.
Yeah, you quote
Trump,
this. Yeah.
Is basically saying, I will pay you. I will pay your legal costs. If you punch these people, well, then he's embroiled in that too.
Yeah, that actually looks a lot like inciting to violence type speech, what candidate Trump said at one of his rallies.
It would be, and if you call what they were going to do domestic terrorism, then it's incitement to domestic terrorism. It's material support of domestic terrorism.
All right, so then there's another important distinction, definitionally, that we have to break down here between an act of violence, which is clearly wrong and is clearly criminal under many state and federal statutes, depending on the particular circumstances. Again, you give the example from Portland recently, where Antifa demonstrators punched and kicked a right-wing writer or columnist, web commentator, whatever he actually is, and doused him with milkshakes. I mean, that's clearly an act of violence. I think under the local or state criminal laws, it would probably be called assault. But is that terrorism? So where is the line definitionally then between an act of violence, which nobody should condone or defend, and an act of domestic terrorism. That seems
Right.
to be an important definitional question.
And again, and I sort of state this in my piece, we have this rough understanding of what terrorism is. But then there's always these debates at edge cases or how far you push it this way or that way. I tend to have a very narrow definition of terrorism because I think we ought to reserve it to a specific phenomena. And if you stretch it out too far, if all of a sudden 9/11 and some journalist getting a shiner is the same thing, then that just destroys the concept. So I tend to sort of see it, and I think I look around at, cases where most people say this is terrorism, here in Northern Ireland or in Israel and the Palestinian territories. I sort of tend to say that it's basically the level of violence has to be lethal or very much or threatening death. That's where it has to be. It has to be something. Has to be the point where that the person means business on the other end. That this resembles an illegal form of warfare.
So far, what you've identified in trying to get at what should be the definition of domestic terrorism are a couple of concepts. One, that it's an extreme act of violence, one that threatens death, or mass death even, and it has to be targeted against a civilian population.
Right. And three, there has to be like an underlying political cause. One of the things that sort of made me wonder was when Representatives Michael McCall and Randy Weber and Henry Cuellar submitted their own domestic terrorism bill in mid-August. This was called the Domestic Terrorism Penalties Act of 2019, and they cite not just the El Paso shooting, but the Dayton shooting, which is weird because Dayton had nothing to do with terrorism. There was no obvious political underlying motive to that mass shooting, which made me wonder what was going on. What was the objective of this bill?
Well, I agree. I mean, the Dayton shooting really stands apart from some of these others. You could say that the Parkland shooter or the Sandy Hook shooter, whose crimes were as heinous as any we've experienced in this country, but there was no political agenda behind those.
Right. It's not enough to simply say this person's a Republican, this person's a Democrat, or this person's a socialist, or this person's a Muslim. The action itself has to be directed to some sort of political objective.
Well, now the El Paso shooter, in very significant, distinct ways, was targeting. You could say may have had a political motivation. I mean, there's a manifesto. There's all kinds of speech before the shooting that takes place on some of these shady, spots on the internet, and then he's targeting He's obviously targeting Hispanics, given where the shooting took place and how the shooting took place. Does that meet the definition of a terrorist act? I mean, clearly it's a hate crime under existing federal and no doubt state hate crime laws. But does it cross over into domestic terrorism, given that he did seem to have a political motivation, that is to target Latinos in this country or immigrants?
I would say that what he did was domestic terrorism. It meets the definition, the very already loose definition that the federal government has for domestic terrorism. the issue was in that case, and what's been inspiring these bills, presumably, is the fact that there is no federal crime for domestic. There's a definition, but there's no federal crime for domestic terrorism in general. So he committed mass murder, and they're seeking the death penalty for him, and they described him as a domestic terrorist. But the laws that he's actually going to be on the hook for is not something called domestic terrorism.
Well, there is a bill I pulled up this morning called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2019. It's introduced by a number of senators. It's Senate Bill 894, if anyone wants to look it up. Number of the presidential candidates, Klobuchar, Booker, Kamala Harris, and a number of other senators, looks to be all Democrats, are sponsoring this bill, and they do give as examples what they call attacks by far-right extremists. Even if we put aside that, what may be sort of loaded in that expression, I mean, most of these examples given in the bill, I think many would say, sure look like acts of domestic terrorism.
Sure.
Attacks on Sikhs in Wisconsin in 2012, shootings at a Jewish community center in Kansas, the Tree of Life synagogue shootings in Pittsburgh, attacks in Charlottesville by neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and white nationalists, and those do look like acts of domestic terrorism as you've defined them.
Yes.
Okay.
And there is bipartisan support to get some sort of domestic terrorism law. So, for instance, you have Representative Schiff as well. It's got the Confronting the Threat of Domestic Terrorism Act, as opposed to the McCall, Weber, and Cuellar bill. This one has another section that has like a Privacy and Civil Rights Oversight Board, there to do a public report on the civil liberties implication of the statute 4 years after passage. It's very clear that it doesn't give a list of domestic terrorism organizations specifically because because of the First Amendment implications. But again, this one also lists attacks on military personnel as terrorism, which is a problem.
So I guess a question I have is, what is the point of trying to work through the issues that we're now talking about, and that some are in good faith and some perhaps in not such good faith, trying to raise his issues, when we try to understand what is domestic terrorism as distinct from other crimes that we can identify in our country, whether it be hate crimes or more simple, more straightforward crimes like assault, simple assault on somebody, a barroom fight, as you say. What's one point of making those definitional distinctions, it would seem, if it's with good faith intention behind it, is that we can direct government resources to investigating and prosecuting those organizations and those individuals.
Right.
I would think that's a good thing. I mean, we want to do that where we identify legitimate perpetrators or perpetrators who we can legitimately identify as perpetrating acts of domestic terrorism. That should be a good thing, I would think.
Yeah, and there's also, I think what's also motivating this is symbolic value as well, is to say, especially on the left, I think there's the symbolic value where they're saying, hey, when you commit these acts of violence against minorities, this is on par. This is in the same category as whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS committing terrorist attacks. This is the same heinous thing. And so that's what they're trying to do. Some people say also it's an issue of, getting our labels right. So then, we have this consistent application of knowing who the domestic terrorists are or something like that. I'm not so sure about that because we already have a definition of domestic terrorism. These bills aren't adding a new definition per se. I say it with a caveat because there's some of them, with McCall one, they have stuff about economic damage, which might expand the definition of terrorist.
Well, right, and we, you've brought up the Patriot Act after 9/11 as marking a point where we start as a country to overreach in how we're going to define domestic terrorism and the potential problems with that. I mean, I, as a lover of history, a student of history, I think you could even go back further in time. I mean, and you and I talked about this the other day. It's a good thing to devote government resources, as you and I agree, to investigate and prosecute those groups and individuals who we can legitimately identify as domestic terror organizations. But there can be some significant dangers in overreach. Martin Luther King was the subject of extensive investigation by the FBI during the civil rights years. John Lennon, during the years he was living in New York City, was the target of FBI investigations. I mean, it's not always a good thing to say we want the government to investigate potential wrongdoers if they're pursuing those investigations and prosecutions based on an overly expansive view of what, in this case, domestic terrorism actually is.
And what critics and skeptics of these sort of slew of bills are saying is that there's already there are already all the resources the government can direct towards. If they were serious about white supremacist terrorism, they could go after it now. They could direct resources to it as opposed to, trimming resources. There's nothing that stops them from defining these things as domestic terrorism, shouting it from the rooftops. There's nothing that stops them right now.
Right, just do it.
And if you wanted to plug that hole about mass shootings, you can simply say terrorism is also when you involved in when you're using a gun to engage in political violence for a political to coerce a population, and you could plug that hole that way. The problem is that when you start throwing in property, when you start making it a little bit unclear, property damage, when you start making it a little unclear as to what your threshold of violence is, that's when people get worried, and they should be worried because these things can be abused, and they have been abused in the past.
Well, right, and you have to worry, too, about the potential for hypocrisy here. If from the left you want to label the NRA a domestic terrorist organization, then why wouldn't you also be willing to call Antifa a domestic terror organization? I mean, I don't think you can really splice and dice finely enough to make distinctions in that, or somebody who attacks an ICE facility because they are because they disagree with the administration's immigration policies and practices. I mean,
right.
Where, to me, that's the danger that always exists when you say what you're doing is trying to target terrorism or domestic terrorism, but really what you're going after is speech. Even speech
right.
that's horrible, hateful, odious speech, or speech you don't like, or that you vehemently disagree with.
The you don't like part is very key, because people tend to think of terrorism as political violence I don't like, but when I do like that political violence, then these guys are magically not terrorists. So, and sort of there's the famous line, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And I don't like that expression, not because it's, if it's moral relativism, but because it confuses means and ends. You can be both. You can be a freedom fighter and a terrorist. Terrorism tells you nothing about the specific ideological content of the political objective. The political objective can be multicultural democracy. The political objective can be an Islamic fundamentalist state. It can be national liberation. All those things can be the political objective. What terrorism is about is a critique of the means. So if I'm in apartheid South Africa, and I'm fighting the apartheid South African government, and I blow up a train or derail a train, kill a bunch of civilians, that's a terrorist act. But that says nothing about the value of the ultimate political objective. By the same token, if I'm an Al-Qaeda guy in Iraq and I shoot a bunch of American soldiers, that act is not a terrorist act. That's just not terrorism. You shot a combatant.
Right. We might call that guerrilla warfare, like the Viet Cong in Vietnam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would call it guerrilla warfare, insurgency, whatever term you want to use for it, but that act itself is not an act of terrorism. Now, you could say they are part, and this is where you get the difference between how we treat foreign and domestic terrorist organizations. You could say they are on a list of foreign terrorist organizations, so therefore simply by being a member of that same organization, they are a terrorist, regardless of whether they hand out ice cream or whether they, shoot a soldier or whether they blow up a cafe. They're already a member of that prescribed group, and that's how we treat international terrorism. That's not how we treat domestic terrorists.
Well, and it seems to me too that the problem. It's not just a matter of words or semantics issue. The definitional problem when we're talking about domestic organizations or individuals who engage in what some would want to label as domestic terrorism is that it's much more vulnerable. Those labels are much more vulnerable to political divisions or political disagreements. And if we're going to label this group or that group a terrorist organization based on their perspective or based on the views they're expressing, then what's to say that someday I wouldn't be put into that category? Someone doesn't like my views. And that seems to be the real danger.
Or your association with someone who's already, so let's say you're at the same protest, or you're wearing black, or you have expressed support for their ideas.
Right. If the NRA is a terrorist organization, millions of Americans who donate to the NRA are supporting a terrorist organization. They could be prosecuted for that, theoretically.
And it's funny. So I was, after my article that sort of embodied all my sort of concerns and feelings about these loosey-goosey definitions of terrorism was published, I looked online just to see, the comments. And
that may be dangerous.
It just drove home the point of how partisan these things can become, and how dangerous that is. And I was watching people react purely emotionally. I wonder a lot of times if they even read the article. They were just looking at it and go like, well, Antifa punches people and they wear masks, therefore they're terrorists. Or someone cites how many gun deaths there are in the United States, and therefore, the NRA is a terrorist organization. It was just absolutely nonsensical and driven. And so look, and I guess the people who respond are obviously a self-selecting audience, but it still was. It was very disconcerting to see how emotion-driven it was, and how easily it can be stoked up against the political enemies.
Well, and we have the same problem, I think, in our politics in the way we talk today to one another. We have the same problem with the word inciting to violence. If I don't like the speech that someone is, if I don't like the views that someone is expressing, I can call that inciting to violence. Might very well just be criticism. It might very well just be a view I don't agree with. But I think there's a danger in, as you say, these loosey-goosey definitions, and I should note that the op-ed piece she wrote is fantastic, and we'll put if it's okay with you, we'll put a link to your article in the description for this episode, so people can get it very easily. You can also, I'm sure people can Google your name and they'd find it pretty easily, Erik. But given what you see in this limited commentary that you checked out when you checked out the comments on your piece, I mean, what do you look ahead for us? And maybe we can wrap up with this. Look ahead, because we are entering an ever more intense political time as we move closer to the 2020 presidential election. What do you see happening over the next year or two? If what happened in San Francisco with regard to the NRA and what has happened in Portland and in other places, if those are any indications, what do you see happening as we go forward in this country on this?
I hate to be a political prognosticator, but I don't think it's anywhere good. I just don't. I just see it. The political system just becoming more and more fractured, and just unable to talk to one another because we're losing the ability to have a shared language. We're not, the words are not even meaning the same thing to someone else. When words like terrorism or collusion or incitement don't even mean the same thing anymore to people, then I don't know. It feels almost like as if that there's two separate nations that are growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worry about that a lot too, and we kind of touch on that theme often on the topics that we take on in this program. I'm very worried about it. I think in this case, the definitions do matter, words do matter, and I encourage people again to read Erik's piece on what is and what is not domestic terrorism and why overexpanding our use of that term, both in law and in our conversation as a country, why there's great peril in that. Erik Schechter, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It's been great talking with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.